joining us. We'll be starting momentarily. Thank you. So, a very good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining us today on the South-South Capacity Day of the 5th Capacity Building Hub. My name is Vladislav Arnodov. I'm a Secretariat Coordinator of the Adaptation Fund Technical Evaluation Reference Group, and I will be your moderator for the session today. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of speakers whom I will introduce shortly. But our event today is about capacity building for M&E in adaptation and loss and damage, and we'll talk about lessons from the Global South. And this event is brought to you today by two organizations who are organizing jointly the event, the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center and the Adaptation Fund Technical Evaluation Reference Group. So let me just introduce the co-organizers quickly. The UNEP Copenhagen Center is a leading international advisory institution on energy, climate, and sustainable development. Its work focuses on assisting developing countries and emerging economy in their transitions towards more low-carbon development paths, as well as to climate resilience. And the Technical Evaluation Reference Group of the Adaptation Fund is an independent evaluation advisory group supported by a full-time secretariat, which looks at the work of the Adaptation Fund. Our main function is to implement the evaluation policy of the fund, generate evaluations, utilize the learnings from those evaluations, and also to provide evaluation capacity building services. So what are the goals of the session today? So we're going to focus on a couple of things. So first, we would like to further enhance the understanding of the differences and linkages between adaptation and loss and damage. We also want to raise awareness through this event about capacity needs and gaps for M&E of adaptation and loss and damage. We'll learn from project experiences, share those experiences with you, especially in relation to capacity building, and we'll also discuss the capacity building needs and gaps from the country's view to increase the effectiveness of adaptation measures and addressing loss and damage. So today, as I said, we are joined by a distinguished panel of speakers whom I'm going to introduce in order. So immediately to my left, we have Catherine Martinez. She's from the Ministry of the Environment of Panama. Next to her is Henry Neufeld. I think many of you know him. He's from the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, but he's also a very important person because he's the chief scientific editor of the Adaptation Gaps Report. So he's the person you can talk to about the most recent science. Next to him, we have Terito Story from the Cook Islands. She works at the Office of the Prime Minister and oversees climate change and the implementation of the 4th National Communication Rate. And next to Terito is Tlura Maro. He's from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment of South Africa. And finally is my colleague Sitabiso Gandure. She's a member of the Adaptation Fund Technical Evaluation Reference Group. So without any further ado, I want to move to the first presentation today. We'll have two presentations that will set the context for our discussions, and then we'll move to a panel discussion and a Q&A. And once again, a very warm welcome to all of you here. Now, I want to give the floor to Henry for the first presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll move to this thing here. Can I make it work? Yes, so thank you very much, Vlad, for the really nice introduction. And I'll talk a little bit about loss and damage in this context. Sitabiso will talk more about the adaptation side. But of course, there are interlinkages, and they will come out in this short presentation. So this figure is from the latest adaptation gap report that we launched in November, and it links mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage into one figure, and also where we stand with regard to the negotiations on the blue side, the three interrelated boxes here. So as we can see, temperatures are rising because of emissions, greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide principally. And we have different trajectories here depending on where we go with regard to our policies. We can have a soft landing or we can have a very, very hard landing. And in the middle, you can see the results of adaptation, the risks of associated with each of these pathways for mitigation, and what we can do with regard to reducing that risk. On the top level, we can reduce the risk from a low mitigation, a low emissions scenario, and the residual risks that remain that we cannot adapt to, that are potentially turning into losses and damages, are much lower than if we do not mitigate strongly, and then we run into this very high risk region with, of course, we can reduce that risk through strong adaptation, but the residual risks will be much, much stronger. Yes, so, and then you can see the negotiations on adaptation finance, loss and damage, and the global goal and adaptation, the global stocktake, interacting and helping us understand where we're going with each of these scenarios. So this figure here shows you a number of the losses and damages that we have to deal with, slow onset and extreme events. So you can see drought, cyclones, storms, sea level rise, salinization, degradation, increasing temperatures, of course, heat waves, biodiversity loss, floods, ocean acidification, glacial retreat, loss of biodiversity, and then we can see here different economic and non-economic losses and damages. Just a bit of understanding about what is loss and damage. So we understand loss and damage as the adverse effect of climate change that are not or cannot be avoided by mitigation or adaptation. And there are two ways of thinking about what results in loss and damage: hard adaptation limits and soft adaptation limits. Hard limits are those that are physiological responses to climate change. Ecological systems typically hit physiological hard limits much earlier than what we can do through managing very well our systems, which we could then call soft adaptation limits. And failures to implement adaptation actions for cultural, political, or economic reasons result in these soft limits. So again, in some ways, I've been showing this: mitigation averts losses and damages, adaptation minimizes loss and damage, and then we have to address residual risks either before, during, or after climate events. And similarly, this is presented here, the conceptualizing different ways of loss and damage. There are multiple ways to think about this: economic, non-economic. There are extreme weather events and slow onset events, and we should also be aware that in our assessments, we still are not able to assess very well compounding, cascading risks. What that means is that our projections in terms of the risks we're facing are actually very conservative. They do not address the full residual risks because we cannot account for the complexity of the system very well. This list from the Adaptation Gap Report shows you, and I don't want to go into details, some of the ways we've identified addressing both economic and non-economic loss and damage. And I'd also like to suggest you have a look at the website where you can access a number of case studies that we've been including into this year's report, one on mountains, one on health-related loss and damage, another on planned relocation, and then also one on the Pacific heat dome. So this is supplementary material that you can read in short versions in the report, and then there are more elaborated case studies that are also available as short podcasts. In addition to the GAP report, I would like to talk about some work that we've been doing together with the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, ICAT. We've developed a guide for assessing climate change-driven losses and damages, the objective being to provide methodological elements for assessing these losses and damages at national levels. And that is necessary for us to start thinking about what to do with them and how to monitor and evaluate them. And this is both for domestic purposes and for reporting under the UNFCCC, the BTR, for instance. Here you can see the table of contents and some concepts related to damages and different ways of thinking about non-economic losses, the values that we place in human mobility, in life and health, in biodiversity, in culture, for instance. I will skip these two because Lou will talk about the South Africa case and what we have been doing together with South Africa, but also other partners who are not here, with regard to developing policies to monitor and evaluate better loss and damage. So just one last slide. Investing in climate change now will limit loss and damage in the future. One of the findings from a recent report is that the 55 most climate vulnerable countries alone have had more than 500 billion US dollars in damages for the past 2 decades, and these damages and losses are going to be much, much higher in the coming decades based on the fact that climate change is now really here and it will get worse and worse. But we do need more robust numbers in terms of the costs and also of the avoided costs of addressing loss and damage and adaptation. We need to find ways through which to improve the resources that we have. The current pledges are very important. I acknowledge that. I also acknowledge that it's a great breakthrough to have the Loss and Damage Fund agreed right at the beginning of COP. That was a great success, but we need to scale up the funding because what it is right now is very, very small compared to the damages and losses that we are going to face. And for that, we need to look into much more innovative financing mechanisms, debt swaps, taxes, fees and levies on transport, etc. So many ways through which we can increase funding for loss and damage, but they need to be put into place. And all this, of course, is necessary to insulate low-income countries and vulnerable populations from future climate risks. So I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henry, for your presentation, and it set really good context for the discussion today, especially explaining what loss and damage is and talking about its importance, including from the perspective of having the robust numbers and the right capacity. And before we move to our next presenter, I just want to acknowledge the presence among us of the Minister of Planning Planning, Investment and Economic Development of the Federal Republic of Somalia, the Honorable Mohammed Sheikh Farah Bine Bine. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for joining us here today. So now I would like to give the floor to our second presenter, Sitabiso Gandure from the Technical Evaluation Reference Group of the Adaptation Fund. Sitabiso, over to you. Yeah, you can use this one. And, yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Henry, for also creating that context for us. I know my colleague introduced who we are, the Adaptation Fund. And so the Adaptation Fund really is responsible for funding projects that are country-driven and focusing on building resilience at a country level. And so within that context, myself as a member of the Adaptation Fund, Technical Evaluation Reference Group, our function is threefold, like he explained at the beginning. And so we are independent evaluators, and we are independent members supporting the Adaptation Fund itself in terms of evaluations. And so the Adaptation Fund itself released an evaluation policy. It's October this year. It's been enforced from October this year, 2023. So it guides us in terms of how to support the implementing entities who are implementing adaptation projects on the ground. So it is a policy that provides the criteria that we use to guide. It has got guidance notes as well that guide the implementing entities. So as a member of the TEG itself, like I've said, if you look at the diagram on the screen right now, so we do 3 levels of evaluations as the TEG. So the evaluations are mainly one at a board level, which is at a fund level evaluation. And then also the second level is the strategic evaluations that we also commission. And then the operational level evaluations really are of interest also to us as we look at really how projects are working on the ground. And one of the lessons we are going to share today is the ex post evaluations, which is part of the operational level of evaluations. So this is something that we are so excited about as the TEG, and we are piloting a methodology in terms of also generating lessons from these ex post evaluations. So what are they? Ex post evaluations are undertaken 3 to 5 years after project completion. And here we go back and we look at these projects and we are looking at issues of sustainability of the outcomes and how resilient have these projects been on the ground. And so we have piloted that methodology in Samoa and also in Ecuador. So in Samoa, in fact, both of them are infrastructure projects. Right, they are focusing on building resilience, as I've said. One of them in Ecuador is actually implemented by the UN World Food Programme. And it's an infrastructure project where they are building barriers, right, against flooding and so forth. And also within that, they also support some agricultural activities like community gardens and so forth. Similarly as well in Samoa, it's also in infrastructure projects where they build barriers as well against the coastal area there, against the impacts of climate change. Now, so in terms of ex post, what are we trying to learn? What are some of the lessons we want to generate? Because we want, when we do ex post evaluations, we want to confirm the anticipated and projected changes post-closure. And then also, we want to also increase our upward accountability to our donors and decision makers on some of the outcomes that are generated there. And then also we want to determine how projects contribute to the intended impacts of the adaptation fund itself. And then also we want to verify lessons to improve the design of adaptation projects. And we promoted through our evaluation policy that we don't only want to focus on evaluations at the end of the project. So we encourage the whole project cycle of thinking around evaluations. Right from the design stage, there needs to be systems in place to think about also assessing the outcomes at the end. We also want to cross-check the sustainability ratings. After every project, we do our final evaluations. And within there, we also provide ratings on how the project has performed. So when we go back ex post as well, we also want to cross-check that whether the ratings are still maintained. And then, of course, we want to create transparency for country-level reporting. Now, what are the main lessons that we are learning from these ex post evaluations? We are learning that they are both positive and negative outcomes that we are generating from there. Not all activities are typically sustained, but all results can be learned from. So there is an element of learning that we are generating from these ex post, and we are seeing that we can learn even from both negative and positive lessons. And then there are also questions of why some results lasted in some places over others, and why in some cases they are not lasting. And what we are learning is from Samoa and Ecuador, one thing that seems to come into play really is the issue of ownership. Where there is ownership, whether by communities, by institutions that are working in country, we are seeing that there are sustainability of outcomes. And then at the same time, we are also realizing that context matters as we look at this sustainability of outcomes. In the case of Ecuador, for example, where because of economic challenges that happened in the country, because of landslides that happened in the country. So after having implemented, after the 3 years, and when a landslide happened, and then the economic challenges, you find that the interventions were not sustained. So the differences in context is very important, and also the design, as I've mentioned. Design is very important. We are emphasizing the issues of theory of change. Right at the design phase, we need to know how the outputs will lead to the outcomes and what needs to be put in place and what are our assumptions in that case. And then also what is important is to have strong M&E systems. And what we have realized is that because of the budgets that are allocated to M&E, which are usually very low, you find that in most cases, those are often very much neglected. And then, of course, some outcomes could be sustained differently than originally conceived, given different resources, I've said, and capacities. And this has important future design implications, especially for scaling up for success. Now, what are the summaries, what are the capacities really that are needed from an evaluation perspective? So, as Henry has said, we are dealing with a complex system, right, of loss and damages. So in that case as well, our implementing entities are implementing complex projects and programs on the ground, which are trying to deal with all these complexities and the uncertainties on the ground. So in that aspect as well, there are capacities that are required to be built in order to understand how to implement those projects. And then also there's also, for timely adaptive management, it is necessary to really make sure that there's room for evolving context on the ground, and how do we deal with that? And the third point is project success and sustainability. As I've said, it's important that there's ownership and buy-in in country. And of course, related to building trust and commitment, absorptive capacity, and then also we don't forget the systematic capacity that is there. How do we link local and national design systems within a country context? Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sitabiso, for this. So we are almost like halfway through our event. So now I will just move back to my seat and I'll start a discussion with our panelists today. They set up a very good context, and it's really important now to explore further the capacity needs and also how we can further work together in order to sustain adaptation impacts over time and ensure that there is effectiveness of adaptation measures. So I want to ask actually my first question to Henry and Sitabiso as well. And you mentioned this already in your presentation a little bit, but if you can tell us more how you see from your perspective the effectiveness of adaptation measures, how that effectiveness can be increased in order to have lasting and sustainable impact. I don't know, Henry, maybe you can start and then I'll give the floor to Sitabiso.
Yes, thank you, Rod. A little reference to last year's adaptation gap report, which had a chapter on adaptation effectiveness. And what I'm saying now is basically drawn from that chapter. And what we identified also resonates with what Sitabiso was talking about just now. One thing that we've identified was lack of stakeholder engagement, lack of attention to local contexts, retrofitting development as adaptation, short-term focus, an absence of future climate change projections and understanding, and failure to address social transformation and climate justice as key elements to why we concluded that current adaptation practice is woefully poor, in quotes. So what do we need to do to improve adaptation action, increase effectiveness, basically address, include stakeholders meaningfully in the planning, in the implementation process? They need ownership. Transparency and accountability, predictability of funds are necessary to ensure that we have what I just said, transparency and accountability of the processes. This is necessary. Adaptive management, so when we understand that things aren't working the way we had anticipated in our theories of change, for instance. Investment in local capacities and democratic governance are crucial to enhancing the capacity on the ground and then making initiatives more sustainable long-term. This is the only way that those living under the conditions of climate impacts will benefit long-term. And I already mentioned it, consideration of future climate change is really critical because we can adapt to what we say, what we know is climate, the current climate, but future climate change needs to be integrated into our planning and into implementation depending on the life cycles of the sectors and of the activities that we are dealing with. So there are differences between, say, agriculture and investments in infrastructure, for instance. You need to think, what are the cycles in which actions take place? Integration of local and indigenous knowledge in monitoring and evaluation are also absolutely necessary for monitoring and evaluation for planning, implementation. And lastly, we need to tackle inequalities and drivers of vulnerability in addition to addressing exposure and sensitivity to climate hazards as ways of reducing sort of the underlying climate justice and equity issues that are very often the reasons why certain portions of the population are more vulnerable to climate impacts than others. So these things, addressing these things in our planning, in our implementation, will significantly improve adaptation effectiveness. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. And Sitabiso, would you like to add anything on your side?
Thank you. Just to add on to what Henry has said, I think I'm talking from the perspective, evaluation perspective, from the tag. And what we are doing on our side is to really keep on generating lessons, because it is very critical from the projects that the Adaptation Fund is supporting on the ground. We are using different ways of learning, like I've said, on thematic areas, on different projects. And so as we generate those lessons now, the next step is how do we ensure those lessons feed into these projects? And then that comes the capacity building component. And of course, we are supporting that. We have started having webinars with our NIEs. We have started supporting them remotely or country visits. So in that instance, it's small steps that are leading to really building that capacity and improving effectiveness of adaptation on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sitabiso. And we heard actually very good observations, high-level observations based on the work that UNFCCC and the Adaptation Fund Turkey is doing. But I think it's also important to hear the voices of the countries. And today on the panel we have representatives from South Africa, from the Cook Islands, and from Panama. So I want to ask the next question to the three of them about the capacities that are required and the capacity gaps also that must be bridged to sustain adaptation action, but also to assess past and likely future loss and damages. So I want to start with Tlu. For those who don't know, Tlu is also the head of the South African delegation, negotiation delegation here. This is what my colleagues told me. If I'm not correct, apologies for that, but he's also one of the most fervent advocates for climate change action in South Africa. So over to you, Tlu.
No, perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, we do have a head of delegation. But thank you for the question, and I think there are different capacities that will be required. One is to build the technical capacity to monitor and evaluate both adaptation and loss and damage. And the second is to really have a robust framework that can assist in the collection of information, where you outline very clearly the stakeholders who's responsible for what, and you are able to outline very clearly what indicators, the level of indicators that will help you to collect the information. But of importance is to build the technological capacity, the system that will help you to collect the information, make sure that it's interoperable, because you find a lot of role players into the system, and ensure that the system is accessible. A case in point, in South Africa, we have the National Climate Change Information System, but when you deal with loss and damage, we have the National Disaster Management Center that is able to just provide information of the different disasters that are happening. You have the South African Weather Service that have what we call the KLM database, show you the extreme events and the impacts of those extreme events. So I would say the technical capacity and the technological capacity from the system point of view will be central to enable us to really collect information and measure adaptation and loss and damage.
Thank you. Thank you, Tlu, for this and for emphasizing the need for strengthening the technical and technological capacity. I think that is very important. And I want to also hear the perspective of the Pacific Islands and Story, who is here, Terito Story, who is representing the Cook Islands. So how does the situation look on the ground in your country? What capacity gaps have you identified? What capacity support is required?
Thank you, Vlad. So my colleague here had a lot of good points. There's a lot of, it's similar in the Cook Islands, but as my colleague on the end was saying, context really matters. So I feel like I should provide some for you. So in the Cook Islands, there's 15 islands, and the furthest one away from the mainland is over 1,000 kilometers. So context really matters in terms of how we build our capacity. So you can imagine that in these outer islands, there's fewer people. So there's less, experts out there. There's less people, and they are over the age of, majority are over the age of 50. So these things really come. They have to stay in mind when you look at adaptation and capacity building. We do lack in the technical experts area. A lot of our experts, they are far and few. So what we do have, they are spread thin across a lot of the projects. So a lot of them, they experience a lot of challenges in that way. So building capacity for our local people, and this starts with our youth. Building interest in our youth can lead to a lot of building capacity and getting more technical experts into our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Terito, for this, and also thank you for mentioning the role of the youth in building capacity. So we are very lucky today actually to have representatives from different parts of the world. So Catherine here is from Panama, so she can also tell us about the local context in her country and in Latin America. So, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. In the case of Panama, we have identified that the reduced technical teams that are in the different institutions and entities are very important. And that was because in Panama, we carry out a table validation that was like a meeting with different entities to talk about in a specific area. In Panama, we have two monitoring and evaluation systems, one for adaptation and one for loss and damage. And each indicator, it's related to to the sectors of the NDCs. And this meeting let us know that we tend to think that because the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Environment in their responsibilities have to collect certain data, they should have that data, and sometimes that's not correct. Also, we identified that in order to have a robust monitoring and evaluation system, it is necessary to have a simple language that can help the people that is on the ground, that it's collecting the data in real time, can collect the data well, and we can use that data to analyze at a national level. Also, we have identified the limit access to information and the disperse of the information. Those are some things that we are working on in order to have a better monitoring and evaluation system, and to be able to analyze the progress in adaptation and what we should do to adverse, minimize, and the losses and damage. So those are some of the things that I want to share.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think it's really great that today we have actually two panelists who are also like youth representatives, and they're those who are going to be carrying out the climate action in the future. So I want to ask a follow-up question both to Terito and to Catherine as well. how do you see the role of the youth in capacity building? How do you see the support that young people can provide? And also, I want to ask the same question from a different perspective. How can we support young people to build the necessary capacity?
Well, in the case of Panama, most of the thing is youth. And we think that's very good because we are like creating things. We were part of the construction of our monitoring and evaluation system, and many things that are starting now. So that's very good to involve more people, more young people, and that helps also to have new perspective. The thing that we are supporting in the Ministry of Environment are the internships that we think it's a very good way to help young people to acquire experience and be part of this kind of spaces and learn more about it, expand their capacities, and be part of the future and know more about the future and how they can be supported, letting them be part of these spaces and help them to access to more information, to learn more about it, and be part of the process.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Terito?
Thanks, Vlad. In terms of youth and building capacities, as you all know, youth are vitally important. They are the mechanisms of change. I'm sure you've all heard that before. So they serve a major role in the Cook Islands in terms of allowing for adaptation, not just physical but also social. So they foster the adaptation of the community, their mindsets, and we use this to our advantage in the Cook Islands. I'll give you an example. We had a project. I was telling my fellow panelists that we had a project in the Cook Islands, and it was in one of the furthest islands in the Cook Islands, and it's hard for our office to get there and to make sure that the project is working well and to monitor. So we get these schools involved and we get the community involved. And with this project, we had the school as ownership. They took ownership of this project, and 5 years later we go back to check, and this project is doing really well. And yeah, it's largely accepted in the community. So this is, it's really important for youth to be involved in capacity building and adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Terito, for this. Actually, what you mentioned resonates also with something we saw in some of the exposed evaluations in EFTEC, that ownership is very important for sustained outcome as well. And what you mentioned, including the role of the youth in the ownership, basically resonates very well with that. I just want to open now the floor maybe for some questions from the audience. I can see the lady over there. Okay, I'll pass the mic over to you. And if you can please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Olivia Tatarletti. I'm here with Legal Response International, an NGO providing legal advice at the negotiations. And I guess as a lawyer, I'm coming to this question, wanting to find out from the people here, from the country delegates, if in your country you have somehow the M&E system that is set in regulation or in law, and if it's not, if you think it'd be useful or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so, Blue, maybe I'll start from you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Firstly, yes, it is useful. In the country, we are finalizing the climate change bill, and that bill will clearly have a clear obligation and requirement for the M&E system that will take into account both adaptation, loss and damage, as well as mitigation. And that system would have to generate synthesis reports so that we are able to track progress in terms of where we are. We currently have an M&E system that is, of course, guided by the policy, but not necessarily by law, which we are using at current format, but once the law kicks in, it becomes more obligatory. And we have drawn lessons from the current system that we have, because we are able to draw data from civil society, from business, and anyone who's doing adaptation work on the ground. So we are able to draw that data and information. So short answer is it's extremely useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tlo. I don't know whether Catherine want to add anything or Terito.
Well, in the case of Panama, our monitoring and evaluation system for adaptation is regulated by our executive decree. And also all the information that we collect in both M&E systems are on our transparency platform that it's also regulated by another executive decree. And we are working to have a law related to climate change, and it's also mentioned in this law that is on discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. Terito?
Yep, so in the Cook Islands, we don't have a formal M&E system established, but it is one of the things that we are looking at getting putting into place soon. Like I mentioned before, it is my office, the Climate Change Office, and the Office of the Prime Minister. We implement the projects, and then we carry out the monitoring and evaluation afterward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Terito. Okay. Yeah. We have one more question from the audience.
Hello, this is Richard Jones from the Met Office in the UK. Thank you very much for all those presentations. Very interesting set of interventions as well. This is probably a question or a couple of questions to the Adaptation Fund, maybe to well, I'll be interested in the comments from any of the panelists. But in terms of the there was mention of the youth interns as a way of bringing youth into the sort of evaluation or some of these activities. It seems to me, and this is something I heard in a session that happened this morning about evaluation of early warning systems in the Caribbean and the value of those. It seems to me that this is a very good model. I'm just wondering whether the Adaptation Fund themselves have the ability to have that sort of program that into their grants and their lending to actually encourage the use of some of these activities, like bringing youth in via these internships to be part of that system. So that's one question. The second question is, in terms of the work that's being done on the assessment of these M&E systems and looking the sort of the ex post evaluations, there's work that's going on obviously within the Adaptation Fund on that. Is there any sort of coordination that goes on between the different funds and the different bodies, like the GCF, for example, or the national activities that are funding adaptation? Because it seems to me there are quite a few of these activities that are happening, but I'm just wondering how coordinated they are and if you have any ideas of how they could be coordinated.
Thank you. Sitabiso, would you like to take the question?
Thank you very much. Your first question, very interesting one. As the tag, in fact, it's something that what is prescribed in the policy is having independent evaluators doing the evaluation at the project level. But it's something that probably, because we work very closely with the Secretariat itself, that really deals with that component of monitoring, evaluation, and also having to do, and also the implementing entities themselves, is their responsibility to actually look for independent evaluators to do the evaluation of the projects. But it's something interesting that of discussion that probably we could discuss with the Secretariat ourselves. Very interesting point. And then in terms of collaboration, very interesting, it's very important that, that point. And we have begun recently to really enhance that collaboration with the Global Environmental Fund, GCF, the CIF, and something we did this year, the first of its kind. We have actually a pavilion for all the climate funds, which is operating in this COP. And also, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, we had a session again in the Pacific, where we actually had a discussion as the three climate funds. So yes, there's room for improvement in that element, and moving forward is something that's really needs to be enhanced. A good step, a right step in the right direction. Thank you.
Actually, if I may add something to your answer, so as Sitabiso said, the 4 funds are together this year, but also the funds have been trying to collaborate and coordinate their work for a couple of years now under the complementarity and coherence framework. So I think what you see this year is actually the culmination of those efforts, but also a beginning of a new stage. And I think the way the funds are talking to each other is also something that is really helping all of our partners to move forward. I would like to see if there are any other questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the brilliant presentations. I have a couple questions about the topic loss and damage and adaptation generally. My first question, which stakeholders are able to bring forward definitions of what loss and what damage, and how would you define it? And the second question is, in the 5th Transition Committee meetings, it was decisions that loss and damage fund should be established under the World Bank. So which raised dissatisfactions among the so-called Global South. What is your opinion on that? And some science demand that migrations or human mobility should be recognized as adaptation strategy to climate change. So what is your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Henry, you want to take this question? And Klo, maybe I would ask you also from your perspective after that.
Thank you for these questions, and I think some of my colleagues here on the panel can also add to responding to them, I think. So the definition question, the difference between damages and losses, and I pointed it out in one of the slides, really is that typically we can quantify damage economically. We have assessment tools available that help us do that, most of them economic, but of course there are others. And then the losses are things that are much harder to quantify typically. You know, there are values behind them, they have value in themselves. If you lose your homeland, and if you lose your life due to or health due to climate impacts, these are things that are very hard to quantify. I mean, we've found ways of equating things also, but in reality, these loss of life cannot be brought back, and that's a loss. It's not a damage. We can repair bridges, we can repair things that have broken, and we have a cost for them. But the losses are things that we cannot bring back, and we need to be aware of the consequences of these losses. And very often it might have to do with developing strategies to manage losses in terms of psychological support or developing strategies for mobility, which you say is an adaptation. And indeed, you could you could classify it as a form of adaptation. Adapting to the loss of land might be migration, and yet, we have to address it. We can reduce the trauma connected to it. That's a way of addressing loss and damage, but we cannot bring the land back that's lost. I'll stop here.
Yeah, now just to add on what Henry's saying, because you look at both the economic and the non-economic losses, as you've already alluded to. And the non-economic, you also are able to attach value to it, whether it's the loss of life out of this very extreme event. And these are some of the aspects that we look into. Your interesting question around the negotiations, which I did not want to attempt to respond to, is probably the issue of the modality of accessing the fund is going to be central in taking the work forward. You see, in the GCF, you have a different modality where you have the accredited entities and so forth, and similarly in the adaptation fund. And I believe at the center of the conversation is going to be what modality would be able to facilitate access of information as quickly as possible. And I guess the issue is the direct access issues, where the Global South will want to have much direct access to, can they be able to respond to the challenges that they are having. And I believe those engagement will be going on, and possibly there would be some landing zone on finding how best to address those. But I think that's going to be the crux of it, the modality, the direct access, and how quickly can the countries access the fund. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Tlo. I just want to take one last question from the audience because we are getting closer to the end of our event. I think you wanted to ask a question?
Hi. My question, and I apologize, listening on the floor, I may have missed something. It seems to me that one of the central tenets is that the youth will be one of the most important communities or groups of people to both bring into some of the projects and be invested in that future. So the question is, to this last point, since the psychological impact of what is going to happen is also likely to hit extremely hard on the youngest population, how do you combine that support need with those who are going to be carrying projects forward?
Okay, so maybe I'll ask Terita and Catherine to very quickly give their observations, and maybe Tlo as well.
A very quick one from our side. When we do project prep and project development, we do what we call co-creation. So we start with the communities and those who are in the interface with the youth and the community as large, to ensure that we have representation and they are participating in the design and the development of projects, which enhances ownership of the project going forward, and you build their capacity from development throughout to the implementation stage.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to go on from that, getting them involved, raising awareness earlier, and building their capacity from an earlier stage allows them, to better adapt from the beginning, and then to witness witness climate change and come out better on the other end.
I support what the others said. It's important to involve youth in the projects and let them be part of the process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And before we close, we actually have one online panelist whom I forgot to introduce at the beginning. This is Fateme Bakhtiar. She works with Henry, and I want to invite her, if she can hear us, just to make some observations on her side, the listening to all the presentation. Fateme, can you hear us? Okay. I think we cannot hear you. Can I ask, please, IT to help us with the sound?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for giving me time. Unfortunately, I was not able to participate in person, but I'm happy to have a chance to say some few words. And thanks for great presentations and very brilliant panelist discussions. So my observation, or I'm trying to just provide some few words of what I have observed as like a summary. So what I can say about the capacities that the national governments needed for the assessment of the past and likely future loss and damage, or in general for the effective adaptation measures. As I have heard from countries also, I have learned from other projects working with countries. Firstly is the scientific and technical expertise is crucial. National governments need access to climate scientists, researchers, experts who can analyze historical data, climate project, modeling techniques. So this expertise is necessary to understand what are the drivers of loss and damage and how to assess the impact on various sectors or project scenarios, future scenarios. And also it enables government to make evidence-based decisions and develop effective strategies for their adaptation and mitigations. As you know, mitigation and adaptation, they are needed for avert and minimize loss and damage. And then also I have heard about data management and analyze the capacities that are essential. There are countries that they already have some system in place, as we have heard from South Africa and Panama and other countries. But they really working to centralize this data collection and data analysis. So government needs robust system to collect, store, and analyze data related to climate impact, vulnerability, and exposure. And also, as Katrin said, it's also very important to come up with some friendly or intuitive templates when they collect data from the field. So this includes socioeconomic data, environmental data, information and infrastructure related data, and data related to ecosystem, population dynamic, and also data related to non-economic loss and damage, which are the important part of the assessment, because currently most of the assessment, most of the frameworks, they are very much focusing on the economic parts, but now that we are hearing a lot from the COP, non-economic part of the loss and damage is very important, and in some countries actually is a key element of addressing loss and damage. As I have heard from that the lady asked a question about the psychological impact. So thirdly, about institutional coordination and governance capacities that are needed for the countries. Assessing loss and damage requires collaboration across different government departments, agencies, and stakeholders. So indeed, we need to do capacity building, awareness raising trainings for those people or staff working at the government. National governments should establish mechanism for interministerial coordination, information sharing, and stakeholder engagement. As we have heard from the questions, is there any law coming from this monitoring and reporting? And that's exactly touching that point, that there are countries that still have problem with data sharing system with interministerial So they need to come up with some mandates and some rules to how to share and what to share information. Furthermore, about the financial resources are essential to support loss and damage assessment efforts. We are hearing a lot about the discussions of having loss and damage fund since last COP. So, and also it's also needed to have allocation of some local funds or innovative way of having some funding to cover those lack of budget when it comes to M&Es. So then the other part is the knowledge management and communications. Capacities are important. It's very much related to the transparency. The loss and damage should and will be important part of also the BTR reporting. So we need very much to prepare ourselves how to do this knowledge management, how to come up with a reporting system for addressing the issue or defining indicator for loss and damage. Government should be effectively communicate the findings of loss and damage assessment, both non-economic and non-economic, to policymakers, stakeholders, and the public. This requires clear and accessible reporting, data visualization tool that some countries have started building on that, and effective communication strategies that can translate technical information into actionable insight. That's what we want at the end. So by building these capacities within the national governments, countries can enhance their ability to assess past and future loss and damage. And also I would like to point out that some issues about the involvement of indigenous people and youth. We talked about youth people. So we have heard, but we didn't touch upon indigenous people. So having youth and indigenous people with fresh perspective on the table, it's important part of addressing loss and damage. Indigenous people possess traditional knowledge, as we all know, practices and adaptive strategies that they can develop, it has been developed over generations. So these are valuable knowledge, and their close connection to the land and ecosystem makes them particularly vulnerable to climate change impact. However, these traditional knowledge that they are holding are also offer valuable insight into adaptation and resilience building. So by involving indigenous people in capacity building initiatives, their knowledge can be harnessed to develop context-specific strategies that can address loss and damage effectively. So I have heard that already there are initiatives or that they have this co-collaboration or co-design of the project, and that's very good. And we are also looking forward to have these indigenous people on board when it comes to international decision making for loss and damage fund. We have heard that both youth and indigenous people have a strong sense of integration, equity, and social justice. So it's also a very important point for that. So I think we are a bit short of time, so I don't want to continue. I have more points, but we will also provide some keynotes of the session to the capacity building hub. So you can read more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fatemeh, for those remarks and for the overview of the discussion today. So we're actually a little bit over time, but I just want to give everybody 10 seconds for one last key message that you want to bring from this session home. So maybe, Sitabiso, I start from you.
Anyway, I think the key message is for collaboration, working together to enhance capacity building.
Thank you. Lou?
Yeah, building the technical capacity and technological capacity from the system point.
Thank you. Derito?
More awareness for Pacific Islanders and their situation with climate change.
Thank you. Henry?
Yes, integration of capacity into all our endeavors, I think, is really critical. Thank you.
Catherine?
More collaboration and to have a simply language for help more.
And Fatima?
Yeah, my point is looking at the loss and damage as a standalone, but also remembering the connection and linkage with adaptation, and remembering non-economic loss together with economic loss and damage is important.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to invite everybody to thank our wonderful panelists, and thank you also for joining us today.
Thank you.